welcome to the Student Ministry Conversations podcast with your hosts, Brent Aiken, David Pruitt, and Russell Martin. This podcast is all about equipping, encouraging, and inspiring youth pastors weekly with topics that are brought to the table by youth pastors from all over the world. And now, here's your host for this week, Brent Aiken. Hey, and welcome to the podcast. If this is your first time listening to us, we want to welcome you and invite you over to our website, studentministryconversations.org, where you can find all of our latest episodes, our show notes for each episode, and blog articles. Our goal is that you are inspired, encouraged, and the things that you hear on this podcast can equip you to be a better student pastor for the church that you're serving in. Today, I am sitting down with Mike Haynes. And so, Mike, you might know, you might not, but Mike is the founder of GShades Curriculum, but he's also a youth pastor. And so it's a great opportunity, once again, just to have another youth pastor on the show and talk about different things that are going on. And so before we get started, Mike, tell us a little bit more about you, where you're from, family, whatever you want to share.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I'm from Virginia. I've been doing youth ministry for over 10 years now, which is weird to say because I don't feel old, but I'm starting to get to the age where my students are telling me I'm old. So but I think they're wrong about that. But yeah, just love youth ministry, love students, love working with students, and love resourcing the youth ministry community. And I've been doing that professionally for about 5 or 6 years now too. So yeah, just love this world. I'm a lifer. I don't know if anyone else listening is a lifer, but I'm a lifer, man. I don't have any interest in being a lead pastor. There's nothing wrong with that, but I'm one of those people who I will be doing this in some capacity when I am actually old and not just being called old by teenagers.
That's awesome. And so, with that, the conversation today is something that we're both very, very familiar with, because if you've been in youth ministry for longer than a couple years and you have gotten on the internet at all, you know that there are multiple different options for curriculum. You can find curriculum pretty much under any rock that you turn over. And so it's kind of becoming the question of, we have so much curriculum. We have so many different ways that we can kind of just plug in and play and almost disregard the mindset of actually crafting our own messages anymore. How do we go into the realm of evaluating curriculum? How do we take what is offered and look at it from the lens of, does this fit my ministry well? And then not just take it and run with it, but utilize it and craft it into a message that fits our students. And so I think the first question that we have to ask, though, is how do you define an effective curriculum in the context of youth ministry?
Yeah, and it's a great question, right? I mean, and I think for most of us, the big buzzword that comes to mind is like discipleship, right? Like your curriculum should disciple your students. But I think, and I'm about to say something that we all know, right? But I think sometimes we maybe forget, and that's that discipleship is not something that your curriculum can do. Your curriculum doesn't disciple your students, you do. The effectiveness of discipleship in your youth ministry is way more a reflection of you and your volunteers and your parents than it is your curriculum, because discipleship is about relationships and it's about students following what they're seeing modeled. So I don't think that what curriculum should do for you and how you define an effective curriculum is whether or not it disciples your students, because it's never going to do that. But what it should do is two things. First, it should make your life simpler as a youth pastor so that you can put more time and energy into discipleship. And we'll probably hit back on this later in the conversation, but I'm convinced that there are some curriculum options out there that don't actually simplify your youth ministry job. It makes it harder, actually, in some ways. And so it should make your life simpler. And then the second thing is it should give your students a strong and very clear framework for their faith. So it can't disciple them, it can't do the relationships thing, but it should make your life simpler and it should give them a clear framework.
Yeah, definitely. And so, I mean, I think both of those are important, and especially in different seasons, it is easy to jump into the mindset of like, man, I can't sit down and put 4 or 5, 6 hours into like planning a lesson this week, because I have this fundraiser coming up, and then at the end of next week we have this other thing, and then I'm also like pulled to the side to lead worship or to talk in these 5 other things that I have going on. And so it does get to a busy kind of mindset. But I do think the important thing that you talked about is, I mean, regardless of busyness being a thing or not, finding that foundational framework where your kids can have a firm grasp on what they're learning. And so
Yeah.
I think a lot of times that's missed because um, even in a cultural mindset, we have this focus of like, hey, like the community that I'm in is really, really dealing with this, and so I'm gonna talk about this in my curriculum. Well,
Mm-hmm.
that loses the realm of everybody else that's not in your community because that
Mm-hmm.
might not be as big of an issue. And so, like finding that firm foundational gospel message and using that as the primary focus in your ministry, and not going to cultural topics and relativity, is super, super important. And so, what factors should youth ministry leaders consider when either selecting or designing their own curriculum? Because nowadays, you have places like Download Youth Ministry where you can become a curriculum donor, and like you can give your curriculum to them and they'll sell it. You can do that, or you can go the other route and you can use um, individual sermon series, or you can go to the year long series. There's so many different options. So, what factors should people consider when they are looking into either making their own or selecting a curriculum?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think there in terms of features. We could talk about that stuff, and I'll talk about that in just a second because there are a bunch of features to consider that come with different youth ministry curriculums, and those things are important to consider. But at first, I want to piggyback off of what you just said, and that's that by just talking a little bit about like when most of us when we're considering we think about youth ministry curriculum, not most but some of us, we think about it the way we think about school curriculum, about academic curriculum, right? And so the question is, what do I want my students to know by the time that they leave my ministry? And then we kind of reverse engineer a curriculum or a scope and sequence from there. And respectfully, I disagree with that model of structuring a curriculum because there is, and this is not an objective. I disagree. This is probably very subjective, but it's still definitely my opinion. And I would say I hold it very strongly. There's a lot that I've intellectually learned over my teenage and college and adult years about Christianity and the Bible and faith, but very few of those things. Uh, that are the reason that I've experienced ongoing transformation in the context of the gospel, right? And that's because, and we know this, we all know this, right? Sanctification, it's not a linear learning process. But when we structure our curriculum in youth ministry the way we structure curriculum in academia, we are going in with the presupposition, knowingly or unknowingly, we're going with the presupposition that sanctification is a linear process, and it's not. The most effective Christians, we know this because we all know somebody who's a theology nerd, but they kind of suck as a person, right? The most effective Christians aren't necessarily the ones with encyclopedic knowledge of the Christian stuff, right? The most effective Christians, those are typically the ones who allow the gospel to color the way that they see the world around them. So, to your point, like the gospel being central in your curriculum, I can't think of a factor in choosing a youth ministry curriculum more important than that. Choosing or designing your own, right? You've got to make sure that first and foremost, yeah, we want to talk about family, we want to talk about friends, we want to talk about anxiety, we want to talk about peer pressure, all the things, right? All the things that's great, all is great, right? Those are the topics. But first and foremost, the factor that matters most is this curriculum going to put my students in a place faith-wise where their truth, that's the kid, oh, I know my truth, right? Where their truth is a reflection of the truth of what Jesus has done for them. So there are other factors that matter. Your curriculum content, it should generally fit within the culture and the theological leanings of your church. Okay, so that's very, very important. Even if there are some things that your church believes that you don't personally agree with or line up with that are like secondary, tertiary issues, you still want to honor your church culture above all else because you are under that spiritual umbrella. So your curriculum should honor your church culture, and if it doesn't, then you definitely want to do the work to contextualize that. Your curriculum should also be aimed at teenagers in particular. You do not want a curriculum that is aimed at a different age demographic or a general age demographic, because what teenagers are going through is very specific, and maybe more importantly, the way that teenagers learn is different than the way that adults learn. And so you want a curriculum that's sensitive to the cognitive and psychological like development place that your teenagers are at. And of course, you want your curriculum to be reasonably priced. We all do, because none of us really has an we ain't got the budget for something that's crazy expensive. So you want it to be reasonably priced. So, but the thing, I guess my thought is like most of those factors, like most of us already think about those things. Like there are already factors that are in our minds. We, listen to the podcast and that's helpful, but it's also like most of us already thought about that stuff. The thing that to me seems like it may not totally be on everyone's mind when they're purchasing or creating curriculum, the number one factor is that the gospel has to be central. And if it's not, then I think that we should reevaluate.
Yeah, no, I very much agree. And the thing is I think when we get into different curriculums, I've seen a slew of them through my time in youth ministry, where it's you almost lose the meaning in search of the message.
Yeah.
And that gets to be a really, really big problem, to the point to where there's a lot of times that I get into a stretch of curriculum, and it's like, oh, well, that's great. And then I quit using curriculum for a while because it's like, man,
Yeah.
this is not going anywhere. Like,
Right.
what am I trying to get done with this? And so while I'm not knocking curriculum, there's some fantastic stuff out there, and we use some curriculum annually every single year, and we
Yep.
absolutely love it. But finding that firm gospel foundation when you look at curriculum is super, super important, because when you get into the topics and the thematic stuff, a lot of times the gospel can be really difficult to find, when you get into some of those different conversations. Um, and so obviously, I mean, there's relevance, that has to take part, though. You have to make it something that they can learn from. You're not going to pull out the New King James Version and read your scripture. There might be a youth pastor or two in here that like listening that does, and more power to you. But there has to be some kind of way to make it appropriate, or make it easier to listen, for the students. And so, as far as, I guess, relevance, how do you assess the relevance of a curriculum to the needs and the interests of not necessarily even just youth, but to your own community? Because I think a lot of times we look at youth ministry as this like 30,000 feet view and say, oh, the youth of America are dealing with this, and this. It's like, but what are the youth in my community dealing with? How do you
Hmm.
assess the relevance of curriculum to the kids that are actually in your community?
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, and this is super important, right? So I'll speak kind of to the needs of today's youth in general, kind of generationally first, and then we can kind of attack, okay, contextualize for your community. But to lay some groundwork for my thoughts on this, like every generation develops their own language, and I don't just mean slang phrases. I mean that's definitely true too. But every generation develops their own way of seeing and talking about the world, right? And I think that the job that youth pastors and myself as a curriculum creator, the job that we have is taking the timeless truth of the gospel and putting it in the language that the next generation speaks. Because for better or for worse, each generation, and listen, I want to emphasize, for better or for worse, it's possible that this isn't great, but it's true. Um, every generation seems to place super high value on differing aspects of Christianity, right? We might not like that. We might want it to be perfectly balanced. We want every generation to just have a perfectly balanced understanding and living out the gospel. But that's just not the way human beings are. And since we are working with human beings, we've got to be willing to speak the language of the next generation according to the swing of their generational pendulum. Okay, for instance, right? We'll just like run through it real quick, right? So like what's boomer Christianity? Boomer Christianity comes out of the Jesus movement, right? Boomer Christianity is like revival, right? So that then you go down to the next one. What's Gen X Christianity? Well, Gen X Christianity is moral living, right? No sex, no drugs, no alcohol. It's holiness, essentially, right? That's the pendulum swinging at the revival, and they're kind of hippie and just doing whatever, and but then it swings over to holiness. Millennial Christianity, well, jokingly, I like to say, I think a lot of us do. Millennial Christianity is no Christianity at all, really, but really it's deconstructed Christianity, right? We're Gen Y for a reason. We all this holiness, all the moral stuff, moral therapeutic deism, and we go, yeah, but I have questions about that. And so Gen Y ends up asking a bunch of questions. We end up deconstructing Christianity, right? We ask a ton of hard questions. Gen Z Christianity, like I think we can all agree, Gen Z is speaking the language of health, right? It's emotional and mental health Christianity. And like none of the elevated values are bad, none of them are inherently unbiblical. all of these values find their fullness in the context of the gospel. So I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, does my curriculum or does my teaching strategy speak the language of Gen Z and Gen Alpha? Because as the older generations, yes, our job is to pass down our faith to the next generation, but in a way that's actually not true at all too. Like, in a way, our job is not to pass our faith down, but to bolster and solidify and shore up Gen Z Christianity and Gen Alpha Christianity so that they can be the light of the world, speaking and living out the gospel in the language of their peers, because that's what they have to do. They have to navigate the world that they are growing up in as Christians, not the world that we're growing up in. And so it's not about passing our faith down, it's about strengthening and bolstering and shoring up their faith, their version of Christianity that they are living out. Obviously, the gospel is timeless. Obviously, the gospel never changes, but what we value in the gospel does change from generation to generation. And if we want to reach them, we're going to have to suck it up and speak their language, even if we think their language is dumb, because we're all getting old. And old people think that the younger people's values are stupid. When it comes to your specific community, I think we ask the same questions, right? What language does your community speak? There are words, phrases, there are values, there are even, if you want to talk about the way Jesus talked, parables, right, that I could use in my context in, middle class, upper middle class, Northern Virginia, that if you, do youth ministry in downtown, Compton or whatever, like in urban Compton, like you're probably going to talk about things differently. You're going to address things differently. And so some of that is choosing a youth ministry curriculum. Some of it is probably contextualizing the curriculum you get for your community. But I think both of those things are very important.
Man, yeah, no, that's a great way to put it. And the thing is like, I think so many times we have this kind of combative nature when we look at this mindset of like, we need to translate the gospel into Gen Z and Gen Alpha. And it's like, well, no, they need to accept ours, kind of thing like that. It's like, but basically we're doing the same thing every time we translate the Bible, right? I mean, so like when we look at biblical translations, we are taking what was written, we are taking the inspired, fully authentic word of God, and we are changing it into language that we understand. And so in this same concept, when we adapt curriculum to speak to the needs of Gen Z and Gen Alpha, we are looking to create just a lack of a communication barrier between the gospel and them. And so, man, that's such a great thing. And I love how you said we don't have to pass down our faith. That's not what we're called to do. We're called to help them find theirs, and then build it, boister it, like build this undeniable, undoubtable faith that is just firm in their own grasp. We're not trying to hand down. I mean, I don't know why this makes me think of like the Olympic torch. I mean, we're not passing the flame on. I mean, in some contexts we are, but like we're helping them find the flame for themselves. And so very, very, very cool. And so obviously there's a lot of different things that come into this, and you said it. I mean, the goal isn't discipleship. The goal isn't really trying to like just take things off the plate. The goal is really for you more than anything else to try and get kids to understand the gospel. And so how do you measure the impact of curriculum on a spiritual growth or development level for youth when you look at the nature of curriculum? Because I think we all, for lack of a better explanation, we all like strive for these metrics, and I don't think anybody knows what the metrics that we really need are. We all have our own. And so some people are like, oh, well, we got 17 kids in the building, and that's great. And then others are like, that doesn't matter at all. We had 3 kids go and feed the homeless this week on their own fruition. And so we have all these different mindsets of evaluating or looking at the spiritual development and growth of people in youth. But how do we use curriculum, or how do we measure the impact of curriculum towards that growth and development?
Yeah, this is definitely the hardest question. I mean, this is the thing that every youth pastor, it's the thing every youth pastor is chasing down is how do I know that anything I'm doing is actually working? Because and to steel man the argument even more than what you have already said, or even just to add on, like youth ministry is inherently a sowing ministry. Like if any of the listeners, if you have been at this for longer, at the same church in particular for longer than 4 or 5 years, you have had students graduate who seemed real laissez-faire about faith in middle and high school, and then they come back from college break and they tell you how instrumental, oh, they miss youth group so much and you were so instrumental in their faith journey. Like you had no idea because they were just on their phone. They were just there to talk to cute girls, to talk to cute boys. Like they were so uninterested, or they seemed so. Youth ministry is just a sewing gig, and we often don't know the impact that we're making until years down the road. And that's true in youth pastoring. And I would argue that it's possible that it's true in curriculum too, which is what makes it so difficult to know which one to buy because you don't know which one's going to work the best for years down the road, possibly. But I will say this. Obviously, what we want to see is life change. Obviously, what we're looking for, and I think some ways, some tools, some metrics that we can use. If your youth ministry curriculum provides a common language for students to speak, like ours constantly, GShades constantly repeats the phrase, like pretty much every message for an entire year. At some point in the message, the phrase "through the lens of the gospel" is going to come in. Oh yeah, we're looking at peer pressure through the lens of the gospel, anxiety through the lens of the gospel. We're talking about James with a gospel lens, right? Like if your students are repeating, they're speaking that language, they're repeating those phrases as they kind of talk about their faith journey and what's going on in their life, then you kind of know your curriculum is working at least a little bit. If your students start talking and thinking and living from that kind of framework, whatever the framework is of your curriculum, if they start speaking that language, that's helpful. But I will also say this. Um, it's something said at the top. I'll probably repeat it again before the podcast is over. I think it's maybe the number one takeaway. Discipleship doesn't come from your curriculum. It comes from you. It comes from your leaders. It comes from the parents of the students. So while the content of your curriculum does matter, in fact, content of curriculum matters so much to me that I was so dissatisfied with the content of the curriculums that I had seen out there that I started my own. So I agree that content of the curriculum matters, but the true win of a good curriculum, the true way you measure that it's working, is that the content is so good that it frees you up to focus your time and energy on pastoring your flock. So if you can find a curriculum that simplifies youth ministry for you, you don't have to spend a bunch of time editing it and oh man, it's kind of light, it's kind of fluffy. If you can find a curriculum that simplifies youth ministry for you, then you'll discover that you have more time to do what matters most. And that's going to lead to some really good things in the lives of your students when we talk about measuring the effectiveness of how your youth ministry is benefited from using curriculum. It might actually be a little more indirect than we want it to be because all of us love preaching and we want it to be the most important factor in our youth ministry discipleship. But the truth is, it's not. It's not.
No, and I mean that's fair. But I think, especially when you look at curriculum, they're always, I think that's always on the back of your mind. This mindset of like, oh, what is this really going to do? What is this like? How is this going to affect, or how is this going to change my students? And like you said, we almost get to the realm with curriculum where we kind of are trusting the curriculum to do our job. If that makes sense. And so when we get into that realm, it's a really, really dangerous place to be because A, you're probably really, really complacent with where you are. B, you're probably not putting much effort into what you're doing. And then C, like, I don't know if you're really going to be paying attention to the relationships that you're forming, or you're not going to be seeming like you're putting your best foot forward because you're kind of so checked out of it because you've put all this faith in curriculum, that like discipleship and relationships still have to happen because you can have the best curriculum in the world, but if the kids don't trust you, they're not going to hear a word. And so I think that's important. And I think that's the beauty of what we see in the gospel time and time again. I mean, Jesus made relationships with people. He broke bread. He dined with people. He went to people's houses. Like and even the disciples all the time. I mean, I always joke that I'd love to go back in Jesus's time and just like kind of shadow over, and just watch like a couple days of Jesus being with the disciples. Cause I see Jesus as like the annoyed parent of like, oh, come on, I've told you this like 400 times kind of thing. With this mindset of like, but what he did is he built relationships to the point to where at the end of his time on earth, he's like, hey, who do you say I am? And Peter's like, you are the Christ. He's like, no one told you that. You came up with that on your own, but they came up through that. Peter came up with that through the relationship that was built and through what he had seen Jesus do. And you had to be present and you had to be a part of that relationship in order to see that. And
Yeah.
so I hear all the time, and we had an episode even a couple months ago with Johnny Burkhalter that it kind of became the clip of that episode, and he was like, "Man, I don't remember a single lesson that my youth pastor taught. I don't remember a single worship song that we sang. Like but I remember the moment that I was drawn into the presence of the God." And so, if you, through your relationships and you, through your teaching, through curriculum or however you want to teach, are drawing people into the presence of God, that's what you're doing. And I think that is
Mhm.
ultimately the evaluation standard that you have to hit.
Mhm.
You are presenting opportunities for students to find those moments where they can be real with God. Because in a world where everybody tells you to be fake, God is one of the only places left that really wants you to be real. And so I think kids find that refreshing. I think they find that invigorating, and they kind of find it as for lack of a better word, they kind of find it as like one of the only places that they can reveal their flaws, because it's important. And so when they see this, and when you're giving them opportunities for them to step into that, it's super super vital to your group. And like you said 100 times, and it's probably going to be said 100 times again, because I agree. It's probably the most important thing we'll say the whole time. Curriculum does not disciple; you do. So. Um, but yeah, so looking into that mindset, we have to have discipleship under our umbrella, and we can use curriculum as the kind of opportunity to keep the gospel moving and advancing within the teaching times of our youth programs. So, what, and I think a lot of times this is something that goes into curriculum as well that we might not really hit or think about. Um, how do we need to work on incorporating feedback and evaluation into refining and improving not necessarily the curriculum that we're using, but how we use the curriculum? Because I think a lot of times, and I've seen this time and time again through different youth ministries, they're like, well, man, I bought this curriculum. I paid like $1,000 for this thing, and this thing is garbage. Like, I tried to use it and it didn't work at all, and yada, yada, yada. And it's like, well, what did you do? Well, I just printed it out and I used it. And it's like, but did you look at it? Like, and so like how do you develop this mindset of not necessarily just trashing a curriculum because you didn't like it the first time you used it, but how do you kind of evaluate this process of using feedback and evaluation, whether it be from the students themselves or a self-evaluation or an evaluation from maybe your adult leaders? How do you use that into refining and improving the curriculum that you might be using?
Yeah, I think when you get that feedback, so of course, you mentioned the categories where you want to get feedback from, right? Your students' feedback, we always take students' feedback with a slight grain of salt, because it's not that the opinions of teenagers are untrustworthy. They're actually often very insightful. However, there are times where, and there are some students who will not tell you what they need, but they will tell you what they want. And so it's possible that your students, their favorite series might not have been the series that they needed the most. And that's part of why we have jobs as youth pastors, is because we shepherd the flock, rather than just letting the sheep lead themselves. And so that's a factor. And then, of course, when we talk to the leaders, that's often incredibly helpful feedback, because they did not choose this curriculum. They did not talk to a salesperson. They did not look at the website of the curriculum, right? They were not they didn't drink any Kool-Aid. You just gave them material, and then they were like, okay, this is what we're using now, right? Obviously, hopefully we transition it a little better than that, but that's basically what happens. So, hearing back from leaders and them giving you their opinions on how the material that you're giving them equips them to get real with their students, which is, of course, the most important thing. that is invaluable feedback. And so I would say that what's very important for us as youth pastors is to recognize that our opinion of how the curriculum going isn't the only opinion that matters, and it might not even be the most important opinion that matters. I would say that if we have a team of volunteers, their opinion on it probably matters a little more than our opinion on it, because they are often the ones who are doing life on life, having the conversations with the students after we get done off the stage. And so they're the ones who can tell you, you know what, that talk set me up for a great conversation. That small group guide set me up for a great conversation. The Bible reading plan has allowed me to talk with my students week in and week out about what they learned in their Bible reading this week. So I think that's a really important factor. For us, I think the sense of it, the accountability that we need, or the thing that we need to be honest with ourselves about when we look at our curriculum, to your point, is have we taken the curriculum and then pastored? I think, again, we've said this a couple times. We'll probably repeat it one or more times because it really is the point. Your curriculum doesn't disciple your students, you do. Like, your curriculum's job is not to pastor your students. Your job is to take the material and contextualize it. A good curriculum will minimize the amount of contextualization you have to do, but you're still going to have to contextualize it. And if you don't, then yeah, I would not be surprised that the curriculum doesn't quite fit so well in what you're trying to do in your ministry. And so we can talk more about how you contextualize a curriculum or what you do. In fact, I'll mention it. Like, let me give an example of how you could contextualize a curriculum, because we haven't really talked about the specifics of it outside of, if the content's bad, you have to make the content not suck. But beyond that, like, if your ministry, you know that your vision for your minute, you know that something you want to do is, you want to, get you want to launch a student leadership team, this year. That's something you want to do. Well, your curriculum's probably not going to launch a student leadership team for you, but your curriculum might give you a really good content on ramp to where you got a launching pad to, like, get a running head start into launching it, because students do respond to vision and they respond to preaching combined with an initiative. If you can preach good messages and then give them a call to action outside of that, students often respond really well to that. So again, if you can do that kind of stuff where you marry what you want and what the curriculum is doing for you, I think that's how you get a really good curriculum, and it allows you to evaluate it from a little bit more of an objective place if you can own your part in what you breathed into the curriculum, rather than just saying, "Oh yeah, that didn't work." Right? It's kind of like when you buy I almost said a Bowflex. I don't think they sell Bowflex anymore. That dates me. But let's say Bowflex, because there's no students in the room. It's just us adults here. So, let's say you buy a Bowflex and then you're like, just like hop on the Bowflex and just start doing stuff, randomly, with kind of no strategy, no contextualization to what your body needs. And then you go, "Oh yeah, it didn't work." Like, all right, well, yeah, but the Bowflex is great, but you haven't done the work that's needed to contextualize it to what you need and your body needs. So it's very much the same way with curriculum.
Yeah, and I'm gonna throw a question that we didn't discuss earlier.
No worries.
But with this being said, I think when we look into evaluating and feedback a lot of times the question of, like, how do I do that comes into play. And so, what are some practical ways to, I guess, kind of work on receiving that feedback from your students or receiving it from your leaders? Because, I mean, we both agree feedback and evaluating are crucial to using curriculum, and really just crucial to youth ministry, period. But how do you go about, in a practical way, of getting that feedback in a way that's constructive, that will ultimately help you in the process?
Yeah. So I think it's a little different for the different audiences. So for students, I would say that the best way to do it is, it's going to be a formal thing. You're gonna want to make it anonymous, all that, because of the power dynamics that are at play there. You're going to want to make it anonymous with students, let them just give their honest feedback. You're going to want to do it like once or twice a year, maybe twice a year, because if you do it once a year, they're not going to remember what the series was about 8 months ago. But if you do it twice a year, they maybe can remember stuff. So I think just an anonymous, and you can do it as a response time to a message, right? Like, you can, again, you're taking what you need to do as a ministry, and you'll work it into the curriculum. And so you can, teach a message, and then coming out of the message, the call to action is, hey, we want to hear from you. We want to know, like, how we're helping you grow in your walk with Jesus. So if you would take the next worship song and just jot down your thoughts about each series, we're just going to list the series, give them a little half sheet of paper, pen, little clipboard to write on, or not, or whatever, and just give them that second. You can also do that through a text, like Like you can use technology if you have a remind group, or you've got some kind of group texting thing, or you've got any kind of thing where students can submit things anonymously or whatever through text message. Just have them text your number or text through it, whatever. You can use any platform for that. There's a million platforms, anonymous question and answer kind of platforms you could use, but just texting it out to students and then just letting them give feedback anonymously. That's going to be really, really helpful. You're going to get some joke answers. You're going to get some students who aren't taking it seriously. You're probably going to get some students who say what they liked, and what they liked was, something that was relatively negligible in terms of its importance. But I think that anonymous thing is really important. For leaders, I would actually say that we go the opposite direction. For leaders, I think our goal as the staff people is to develop the kind of culture where your leaders feel safe giving you direct feedback. And so this is not necessarily a super practical answer, but I do think it's a really important one. And that's that if you're meeting with your leaders on a regular basis, if you are in contact with them, if you are establishing relationships with your volunteer leaders the way that you expect them to establish relationships with their students, then you will have a built-in feedback mechanism because you're having conversations with your leaders on a regular basis. They will bring up this worked, this didn't work in the context of those conversations, because that's what you guys are going to talk about. You're going to talk about how small groups going, how's ministry going, right? That's what you're going to talk shop for a lot of that conversation. So I would say for each of them, it's a little bit different. I think you could get feedback from parents too. Again, I would be very careful in asking a parent, how has your child grown over the past year? What have you seen from your parent over the past year? And then take their answer and attribute 100% of the results to the curriculum that you're using. I would be careful to do that because, again, your curriculum doesn't disciple your students, you do. But I think in those three areas, I think you maybe approach your feedback loop in a little bit different ways. But I do think obviously the feedback is important.
Yeah, and I would also say that, I mean, you talked about doing it multiple times throughout the year. I think doing it twice a year, once at the end of every semester, is fine. And then I think as far as the adult leaders, I think you hit it head on. Just this mindset of they need to feel comfortable where they can approach you and say, "Hey, like, man, this was amazing," or
Yeah.
"This tanked so bad," like, because we need to know those things. And then we also need to kind of generate this space and this kind of environment around the adult leaders to where they can also call us out when we're the ones in the wrong and be like, "Hey, you're right. Like this didn't seem like you," or something to that nature. Because a lot of times when we get up into youth ministry, either we don't have anybody that will call us out, or the adults won't, in fear of like offending us or something to that nature. And like, if you want to grow as a person, period, you have to have people that are speaking life and speaking evaluation and critiques into you. Because there's no way that you learn to grow out of your failures if no one points them out. And so I think that's really important. And then like, with parents, we typically do a email once a year. And it's just like, hey, what about youth ministry, and have like 6 or 7 questions. And they'd be like, what was your favorite thing? What did your kids talk to you the most about this year? Or something to the nature, question. Because they will be a lot more invested. And I also say, don't do the like, where do you think that your kid is the most spiritually developed this year? I don't ask that question either, because a lot of times that can also kind of breed negativity from parents, because they might not see it or they might not want it. And those are two very, very potentially damaging routes to go. And so while it is a great question, I don't know if it's always necessarily the greatest question for parents unless you have that relationship with them. It's probably not just a massive parent email blast question to throw out there. But I think all of those are very, very practical routes to do evaluation. But if you're not evaluating, or if you're not having people evaluate you and then how the ministry is going itself, you need to start that like now. If you're listening to this and you've never had anybody evaluate you, I would honestly say that first off, if you're the only youth pastor at a church, you need to have your pastor evaluate you off of what he's heard from the church, what he's heard from parents, what he's heard from students. That way you have that person that's going after you. It might not have to be your senior pastor if you have other people on staff, but in smaller church contexts at least, probably your senior pastor. You probably need to find a parent that's heavily involved, and you need to have their feedback regularly as well. Your adult leader, your adult volunteers feedback, your students feedback, parents as a whole. And then quite honestly, if you have a network of youth pastors in the area, man, I hate to pull this into a Wesley conversation, but like you need to be meeting with them and having the real accountability conversations of like, man, like I'm just not in it. Like this week has been awful at home. Like everything has gone wrong. And man, it's just been a really, really rough day because those are the people that are going to understand. Those are the people that are like, hey, I've been there. Like I'm walking in your shoes right now. We're going through this together. All of those are vital to developing you as a youth pastor, developing you as a person, as a leader, etc. And I know that goes a little off of the context of our conversation today, but I think that is vital. And I don't think that's something that we've done a lot of conversation on in our podcast yet. But like, if you aren't evaluating and getting feedback, you need to start now. Airplane, land it. Let's go back into it. And so I guess the only other things that I can really kind of think of through this is I think I mentioned this earlier in the podcast. One of the things that kind of, I guess, makes people nervous about using podcast is allowing youth pastors to use curriculum is this mindset of like, oh man, what happens if they bring up this topic and I don't know if this is the right topic to talk about, or I don't know if I'm going to be able to use this in a conversation, or I don't know if I'm going to have answers to back up this curriculum, and all this mindset. So how do you address sensitive or controversial topics within a youth ministry curriculum? Because I'm going to be honest, this is one of the realms that I actually use curriculum in the most, because it's something that I don't want it to be just what I can think. I want it to be what has been kind of tested over and over and over again. And so especially we do a relationship series every other year, and it includes a sex talk. And my relationship series is curriculum. I found one that I love, and I will adapt it and model it and change it as the years progress. But time and time again, feedback on the series is like, man, I understood all of that, and it wasn't super awkward, which is probably the best feedback you can get from a sex talk in high school. But I think it's one of those things that, like, how do you address these different topics as they arise in curriculum? Because they're really, really important. And so how do you use curriculum to address these topics? And then I guess how do you follow up with, like, I guess doing your homework to make sure that you can back up the curriculum with your own study?
Yeah, I love it. And here's the difficult thing. This is the difficult truth about curriculum and the curriculum world. Like curriculum companies, like most of us don't want to address like certain hot button topic issues, right? Like there's certain stuff that like most curriculum companies don't want to touch that. And it's not about fear, right? It's not about being afraid of it. It's not about not having the theological chops to address it. It's none of that stuff. It's that it might just be impossible to create a series around, for example, like LGBTQIA stuff, right? That culture, right? Like it it might be impossible to create a series around that, a teaching series around that that both fits in an extremely wide swath of church context and also actually says something. Like you could probably create a series on that topic that fits everybody, but that means the sermons ain't actually saying nothing. It's vague, fluffy nonsense, and you as a youth pastor, you're gonna have to just write that sermon yourself anyway from scratch because what you're given isn't saying anything. So for those reasons, curriculum companies for the most part will stay out of certain hot button issues. But you mentioned sex and dating. There's things like GShades. We've covered stuff on politics, anxiety, human trafficking. We've done sex and dating. And so I think the beauty of how we approach curriculum is like, in our particular context, we're looking for a gospel lens on how to navigate those things. And that means that we don't feel the pressure to teach students every single detail of what to believe or what to do, but more so giving them a framework of how to approach those issues in a healthy, gospel centered way. And so I think that kind of approach allows you to teach from the stage, something that still allows you to kind of feel in your lane. It feels healthy, it feels good, it feels helpful. But then there are some because I'll mention this too. There are some hot button issues that probably shouldn't be monologued on from the stage. And I know that we like, some of us really like to we want to preach the whole counsel of God, and we preach on everything and all that. And I get that, and I think that you can preach on everything, but I would say that there are probably some topics, some issues that the conversation is going to be significantly more effective if it is done in a dialogue and not a monologue. And so I think for that reason, like, when the way that we evaluate whether or not a talk that we've done on whatever has gone well is, you can talk with your leaders afterward. The question, was it awkward? That's important. Now, it's not all consuming, because students are inherently awkward sometimes. Just because they feel awkward doesn't mean you presented it in an awkward way. But I do think you should ask that question. I think it's worth asking that question so that you evaluate when you do use a curriculum that touches on a touchy subject. The A super important thing to do is that you are not the only person who has eyeballs on that. Yes, the curriculum company, in theory, there are probably lots of eyeballs that were on that before it was published. That's great. But now you're talking about your context. So you should have eyes on that. You should probably have your boss, whoever your boss is, should probably have eyes on that. I know that they're a party pooper. I know that they don't do youth ministry. I know that they're probably going to, they're going to rain on your parade sometimes. I get that. But it is always better safe than sorry. And then, much like the feedback loop that we were talking about earlier, if you've got a trusted parent, one, not all of them, one trusted parent who way ahead of time, way before you're publishing this, way before you're putting the series out there, you got one trusted parent who can look over your content and give their thoughts. Someone that you trust, someone who's balanced, who's not going to come at it from a place of helicoptering on the one hand, or from a place of, who cares? Just teach them whatever. Just say whatever. My kid's fine, right? Just something in the middle on that. I think that's going to be really, really helpful. But don't be afraid. We shouldn't be afraid of hard topics. Our students aren't afraid of hard topics. They are asking questions about hard topics. We want church to be a safe place for them to talk about those hard topics. I just believe that we need to go in with the expectation that not every curriculum is going to address every hard topic. And when you do address a hard topic, it's possible that the way that you address it would be more effective as a dialogue rather than a monologue.
I think that's good. And I think that's the beauty of, bringing conversations into small groups. And I think that's where curriculum really kind of, in my opinion, I think that's where curriculum honestly kills it. Because that's the thing that I struggle with the most, is developing those small group questions, developing those dialogue conversations that happen, because those are probably the most meaningful and changing conversations that happen. Sure, they listen to you talk through the lesson, they get the points, but the small group dialogue is 9 times out of 10 where the wisdom that is taken from the lesson is transferred into, or the knowledge that is taken from the lesson is transferred into the wisdom that they can apply into their lives. And I think that's really, really important for so many different ways, because that's also that's how curriculum helps, if any, on your path towards discipling others. It's those dialogue questions that are brought into the picture to where you can have those conversations and say, hey, we just talked about how James, the book of James correlates directly into the gospel, but how do we live this out? How do we go and take what we've learned from James's writings and put that into play into our lives? And so having those dialogue conversations where the students can kind of connect point A to point B with your help or with your adult leader's help is very, very important. And so I am we're getting on the closing side of this conversation, but I always have 2 other questions. First off, and you can answer these at the same time. First off, do you have anything else that you want to talk about when it comes to curriculum that we have not covered? And then secondly, especially for all the youth pastors that we have on here, I always like to ask the question of what would be your one word of inspiration or one word of encouragement to the youth pastors that are listening to this. It can be off topic of curriculum, just your one word of advice or one word of inspiration or wisdom that you'd like to share before we close.
Yeah, I'll answer the second question first, and then there is one more thing that I really, really wanted to hit. In the second thing that we'll touch on that I wanted to hit. This is if you would have me back on podcast, if you get positive feedback on this podcast episode, and you're like, oh yeah, we would have Mike back sometime. I would love to do a podcast episode on this second thing that I'm going to touch on, but like entire podcast, I could talk about it for 3 hours, easy. Although we never would because that's too long of a podcast episode. But I'll hit the first thing first. The first thing that I would say is just a word of encouragement to any youth pastors listening is that you matter way more than you think you do, and it's not because of your job. It's because of your God. It's because of who God has created you to be. It is because of what Jesus has done for you in the gospel. You matter. Your presence matters, and I think when we talk about your curriculum doesn't disciple your students, you do. One of the lies from the enemy that many of us believe is that we don't really matter that much, that we're not really the secret sauce in our students coming to know Jesus at a greater level. And I want to push back against that. I'm not trying to puff you up. I'm not trying to get your ego going. That's not the point of this. I just want you to know, and this is back. It's all over the gospel. You matter. Your presence matters. You are where you are for a reason. So 100%. Use curriculum. I mean, I sell curriculum for a living. Please use curriculum. Use my curriculum. But I want you to know that ultimately the most important thing that you do is not use curriculum. The most important thing that you do is show up week in and week out and meet students where they are. So don't forget that you matter. It is rooted in the gospel, and eventually it makes its way out to the branch. The gospel is the root, and it makes its way out to the tree leaves and the fruit of you showing up to youth group week in and week out. You matter so deeply. So that's the first thing that I would say, just as a word of encouragement. I do want to touch. I'm going to try to keep it super brief, but I'm so passionate about this. This matters to me so much, and that's when you are teaching. Okay, whether you're using a curriculum or your own stuff. Okay, when we talk about keeping students engaged and interested as you're teaching, or when you're using a curriculum. Okay, this is probably the number one thing that I am most passionate about when it comes to preaching and teaching. Okay. Um, when you are teaching, if you want to keep a student's attention, and you don't want to have to do the circus of, you got to have all of these, you got to have every 5 minutes, you got to introduce a new story. You got to have a new story. You got to get their attention back with an object lesson. You got to do cartwheels, and you got to do the whole circus just to keep their, no. Let's not do that. Instead, if you want to keep students' attention during a message, stop giving away the punchline too soon. And this is something that this is like old school preaching philosophy. So I'm about to you tell your professors and your college professors, your seminary professors, they can come at me about this, but I believe this so deeply. Like we so often we will like show up and we'll go, okay, we'll go, hey guys, what's up guys? Well, because we all talk like YouTubers, right? What's up guys? Today we're going to talk about peer pressure and why we should value God's opinion over the opinion of our friends. Well, you just ruined the punchline. You just disincentivize students from listening to the rest of the 15, 20, 25 minutes of your talk because you spoiled the ending. And like, and the hard part is you've spoiled the ending before you've even given yourself a chance to build out the world of the joke, so to speak. Like, obviously, do if you want to keep their attention, like they're coming in, students are coming in, they're so distracted, they got so much going on, they got so much on their mind, right? They got TikTok and they got drama and they got parent stuff and homework stress, right? They're so distracted, right? And your goal is you want to take this generation who has the lowest attention span in human history, and you want to hold their attention to your sermon for 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 25 minutes. Some people teach for 30 minutes in their youth group. You want to hold their attention for that long. Okay, if you want to capture their attention, then you need to world build at the front end of your sermon. I just think that's going to be your easiest path. I'm not saying you need to do it. Some of you are great preachers and you don't preach the way that I preach. I get that. I respect that. But I'm telling you, it'd be so much easier if you would world build at the front end of your sermon. So if you're talking about peer pressure, that's great. Spend the first 4, 5, 6 minutes of your talk world building around the problems of peer pressure. Talk about how it feels, how it sometimes it's a good thing. Sometimes peer pressure is a bad thing. Sometimes it's a good thing, and that's confusing. And give specific examples of peer pressure. Talk about the effect of peer pressure on our mental well-being. Talk about the consequences of caving into peer pressure. Talk about the consequences of not caving into peer pressure. Roll students around in the mud of the problem before you cover the solution with them, because if you take them to the solution too quickly, you have now disincentivized. But if you can roll them around in the problem, you can just cover them the filth of the issue that you're going to address with scripture. Now when you crack open the Bible, now you got students leaning in. Now you don't have to do the circus act in order to keep their attention. They're leaning in because what you are telling them is something that they have been looking for an answer to for forever, and the only way they will find that answer is if they lean in and stick with you as you walk them through scripture. So please, oh my goodness, if you want to keep students' attention, you do not have to do all of the, listen, object lessons are great. I'm not knocking object lessons. Funny stories are great. I tell funny stories all the time. Funny stories are important, but like, you don't have to do the circus act. Like, students get enough circus act on their phone, but like, what if you want to hold their attention, don't ruin the punchline, yo. Like, roll them around in the problem a little bit before we start walking them through the solution. So that's something that we thought about covering in this podcast, and then it was like we weren't gonna have time, and then I was like, I'm just really passionate about it. I could do
No,
an
that's
entire
great.
podcast episode on it,
That's
though.
great. And honestly, I totally planned on hitting that question. I completely skipped over it in my notes on accident. So I'm really glad you went back and hit it. But with that being said, for the people that are like, well, roll around in the mud, what do you mean? Can you give like a 30-second example of like, what do you mean by like rolling around in the mud and finding that punchline?
Yeah. So if you want to roll them around the mud of the problem, right? It's the idea of like, okay, if you're going to talk about, I'll use a different example. You're going to talk about anxiety. Okay, every student kind of inherently knows in their brain why anxiety is a problem, but it's actually like the gospel lays it out this way too, right? Like, you roll over them around in the problem of sin, right? Like, the sin is the bad news. You've got to sit with the bad news before the good news can become good news. And too much, we will just rush to the good news in our talks. We rush straight to the Bible. We rush straight to scripture. We rush straight to what God thinks about the problem. No, stop, pause, hold. First, let's roll them around in why anxiety is such a problem, because some students might not be aware of why anxiety is such a problem. Some students might not be aware of why peer pressure is such a problem. So let's like roll them around in it, and by the end of it, they'll be nodding their heads like, oh yeah, you're right, that does suck when I cave into peer pressure. That does suck when I stand up to peer pressure, and then I experience consequences of it. You're right, that does suck. How do I handle that better? How do I handle that in a way that's healthy? How do I handle that in a way that honors God? I do want to know that. I do want to know the answer to that. Let me lean in and listen for the rest of the talk so I can find out. And if we don't do that, if we just rush straight to the good news without rolling them around to the bad news, and the good news isn't really that good because we haven't sat with the bad news for long enough. So that's kind of what I mean when I say, roll around in the mud of the problem. Yeah.
Sure. No, and I just wanted to make sure that was clear because I think that's a great point. I mean, you don't really think about it, I guess, when you come into this conversation, because in all reality, all you're thinking about is like, oh, hey, like the good news of the gospel, good news of the gospel, good news of the gospel. But like you said, if we don't present the bad news, good news isn't good. Like, it is the good news, but at the same time, they have to know why it's good. And so that is a vital part of this. And so, last things, man, this is your time to spotlight anything and everything that you do. How can people connect with you? What do you have going on with GShades? How can people find out more about GShades? Anything else you want to share?
Yeah, so we talked about GShades as a youth ministry curriculum. That's true. We're kind of the fresh face on the scene. We are a newer curriculum on the scene. It's probably why a lot of you haven't heard of us before. We're just new. We just haven't been around as long as some of the bigger companies. But I've been around long enough to use and write for a lot of the biggest companies. We mentioned DYM, right, and their stuff. Like, I've contributed to DYM. I've written for Orange. I've written for Grow. I've done all of that, and I've used a lot of that stuff. And while what other curriculum brands create is really amazing in a lot of ways, a lot of what's out there doesn't necessarily inherently make the central thing central, and that's why I created GShades. And so the question that our curriculum and our company asks is, the gospel is central to our faith, so shouldn't it be central to our youth ministry curriculum? And that's kind of the question that's guided how we've created things. And so we consider ourselves your simple solution to a gospel-centered youth ministry. Our curriculum, it always comes with video messages. It's not an extra add-on. You don't have to pay more. It is just always included with every tier, and the first tier starts at under $600. So your curriculum, video messages with everything. You can diversify your stage communication. It gives you a break, increase your digital reach with video messages. Our curriculum we have tiers that include events, camps, parent and volunteer resources and training videos and all the graphics and games and manuscripts and small group questions, all the things. It is your simple solution for a gospel-centered youth ministry. It gives you all of the framework and it frees you up to do what matters most so that you can do the work of discipleship, because the framing of your yearly ministry calendar and then also your teaching content is taken care of. And if you are a youth pastor, you're volunteer, and you don't really like being up there and teaching, or you just need a break and you don't want to do it every single week or whatever, you like, the video message is incredibly, incredibly helpful. And there is no other curriculum out there that is giving video messages at this affordable a price. So if you are interested, if anything that I have said today has resonated with you as a listener and you are curious how to learn more about this curriculum that me and my team have created, you can catch your first glimpse of life through the lens of the gospel with a 4-week free trial at gshades.org, and we will include that link in the show notes.
That's awesome. And then finally, if they want to reach out to you, how can people reach out to you specifically, so they can maybe talk more about this topic or reach out and just connect with you, whatever they want to do?
Yeah, I'll give 2 ways. So one way would be kind of an indirect way, but still better than just talking to me, would be talking to a bunch of people who are interested in this gospel lens kind of approach to youth ministry. And so if you search Facebook for the group GShades, or it's facebook.com/groups/GShades, you will find a youth ministry community that we've started. It's still pretty small, so that means that your questions are definitely going to rise to the top for sure, and you can connect with all kinds of youth pastors, including myself, about just what gospel-centered youth ministry looks like. But then secondly, you can reach out to me on Instagram. You can find me at Mike E. Haynes, and we'll put that in the show notes too. That's at Mike E. Haynes, no periods, none of that stuff. Or you can reach out to me over email too at mike@gshades.org.
Awesome. Well, Mike, thank you so much for coming on the show. But that is all that we have for this show. And quite honestly, it was a good one. I can't wait for this one to come out. But if you were a frequent listener of our podcast, all we ask is that you do your part to get our podcast out to the greater student ministry audience. As you know, we are in season 4 of our podcast, which is mind-blowing to me. But there's still a lot of people, just like Mike said about GShades, that don't know about our podcast. And so if you would share our podcast with your youth pastor friends on social media, or tag a specific episode that stood out to you. Maybe it was this one because Mike killed it. And either way, though, be sure to tag us in your post as well on your favorite platform by using @TalkStudentMen. And then finally, if you'd like to be like Mike and come on the show in the future, you can reach out to us on social media, like I said earlier, @TalkStudentMen, or you can send me an email, brent@studentministryconversations.org, and we'd love to set up a time that you can come on the show with us. But Mike, man, this conversation was a blast, a lot of fun. I think it's honestly... I love getting to conversations that we have not had before. This is going to be episode in the 150s on episodes. And I don't think we've ever actually done an episode that was entirely on curriculum. And so what a great topic, talking through and figuring out how to evaluate the curriculum you use and how to utilize it to make it more efficient for you. But man, I'm excited for listeners to hear this one. So if you are listening to this, thank you for listening. We hope you have a great week, and we will see you next time.